Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, 4,000 years ago, a man is eating his evening meal. He is not a king, he is a landowner, a merchant of moderate success, respectable by the standards of his city. He has a large house, a clay tablet recording his debts, and two wives. One he married 20 years ago, one he married 3 years ago, when the first had not yet produced a surviving son. Both women are in the same courtyard right now. The first wife is instructing a servant. The second wife is nursing an infant. They are not speaking to each other. They have not spoken to each other in 6 days. The man eating his evening meal is aware of this. He has been aware of it for 6 days. He has never known what to do about it. This is the part of ancient polygamy that the history books leave out. When most people hear the phrase multiple wives in ancient times, a specific image forms: a throne room. A powerful man surrounded by adoring women, silk and incense, and the uncomplicated pleasures of total power. That image is wrong in almost every particular. The reality of polygamous households in the ancient world was something far more complicated, far more political, far more exhausting for everyone inside them, including and especially the man at the center. Let's start with why it existed at all, because the reason is not what most people assume. In a world with no vaccines, no antibiotics, no way to predict whether a child would survive its first fever or its first winter, the death rate among children was devastating. The best estimates from skeletal evidence and modern hunter-gatherer comparisons suggest that somewhere between 30 and 40% of children born in ancient societies died before the age of 5. 30 to 40%. In that world, one wife was a biological gamble. She might not survive childbirth. Her children might not survive childhood. And if a man's entire estate, his alliances, his land, his accumulated power had no living male heir to pass to, it dissolved. It went to rivals. It went to creditors. It disappeared. Multiple wives were not a luxury. They were a survival strategy. The more women a man had bearing his children, the better the odds that at least one son would live long enough to inherit. This is the foundation the entire system was built on. Not romance, not desire, pure arithmetic. The kind that does not care about feelings and only cares about who survives. This is why polygamy appeared independently, in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, India, the Hebrew kingdoms, the Aztec Empire, feudal Japan, West African kingdoms. None of these societies invented it by copying each other. They invented it by facing the same problem and arriving at the same cold calculation. A man who wanted his line to continue needed more than one woman producing children for him, and so he arranged it. And the world arranged itself around that fact for most of recorded history. But here is what that arrangement actually looked like from the inside. In almost every ancient polygamous culture, not all wives were equal. There was always a hierarchy, legally defined, enforced ruthlessly, and it determined everything about how a woman lived and how her children would be treated when their father died. In ancient China, a man of sufficient rank had one principal wife, the Zhengqi. Her position was protected. Her sons inherited first. Her status was tied to her husband's rank in a way the secondary wives could never match. In ancient Egypt, the great royal wife held a formal title. She appeared in official carvings. She had her own household, her own income, her own staff. The secondary wives lived in a separate compound with its own economy, its own politics, its own power structure that the pharaoh himself often had little visibility into. The man who controlled an empire frequently had less control over his own house than over the armies he commanded. The women inside were not passive, they were constantly strategic. The principal wife controlled access to her husband. The secondary wives watched for any opportunity to rise. All of them understood their position could change in a single conversation. We don't have many first-person accounts from inside these households. What we have are legal documents, court records, letters pressed into clay, papyrus fragments. And what those records show is a picture that looks less like paradise and more like a small government in a permanent state of cold internal war. The principal wife in ancient Rome was never entirely secure. Roman law allowed a man to divorce with relative ease. What protected her was not the law. It was her connections, her family's wealth, her political usefulness, the loyalty she had spent years quietly building. She controlled who had access to her husband and when. She kept her children visible and favored and positioned. All of it had to look effortless. None of it was. For the women further down the hierarchy, the picture was starker. A concubine had resources she would never have had otherwise: food, shelter, protection, a status above a common woman. But she had no permanence. Her position depended entirely on continued favor, on being preferred, on producing children who survived and who were valued by the man who controlled everything. Favor in an ancient court was the most volatile currency in existence. It could vanish in a single night, in a single conversation, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. And this is where the story becomes genuinely dangerous, because every wife who produced a son had a son who was a potential heir. And potential heirs in the ancient world were not just assets, they were threats to each other. The history of ancient polygamous dynasties is substantially a history of sons killing sons. In the Ottoman Empire, which developed one of the most formalized systems of this kind in history, there was a practice called fratricide by law. When a new sultan came to power, he was legally permitted, in some eras legally required, to execute all of his brothers. Every single one. Because every brother had a different mother, raised in a different wing of the palace, with a different group of women and advisors who were loyal to him and had spent their lives making sure he was the one who would come to power. Every mother had spent years, sometimes decades, positioning her son for survival, accumulating favors, building alliances, eliminating rivals in ways that left no visible evidence. This was not an Ottoman peculiarity. In ancient China, succession wars between sons of rival wives brought down entire dynasties. In ancient Israel, the household of David reads like a detailed account of what happens when many wives produce many heirs, and all of them are told there is one throne and only one of them can sit on it. They did not share, they fought. In every dynasty, in every culture, in every era when this arrangement was common, they always fought. The multiple wife system produced the heirs, and then the heirs destroyed each other, and sometimes the entire civilization went with them. Now here's the part of the story that consistently surprises people. Having multiple wives in the ancient world was not experienced by most men as a privilege. It was experienced as an obligation, an expensive, politically complicated, personally exhausting obligation. Only the very wealthiest could afford it. Multiple wives meant multiple households, or one enormous household with entirely separate quarters for each wife and her children. It meant feeding and clothing and maintaining all of them at a standard appropriate to their respective rank. In ancient Jewish law, a man who took a second wife was legally required to maintain the exact same standard of food, clothing, and conjugal attention for his first wife that he had provided before the second arrived. He could not quietly reduce her expenses. He could not neglect her. If he did, she had legal recourse, and the records show she often used it. Multiple wives also meant multiple families, multiple mothers-in-law, multiple networks of political obligation, because in most ancient cultures, a wife came with a family, and a family came with expectations that did not end at the wedding ceremony. The kings and emperors with dozens of wives were not relaxing. They were managing small nations inside their own walls, grievances to hear, rivals to watch, heirs to manage, factions to balance. The surviving records suggest many of them found it relentlessly, quietly exhausting. Not every ancient culture chose this. Ancient Greece maintained monogamous marriage as the legal standard. A Greek man might take a mistress, but his household had one legal wife. Rome was similar. Roman law said one wife. Even emperors could not override the social weight of a Roman marriage without paying a real political price. These were not more enlightened positions. They were different calculations. Monogamy produced cleaner succession, fewer competing heirs, a more predictable transfer of property down a single clear line. Different civilizations looked at the same problem and arrived at different answers. The polygamous household systems of the ancient world did not end because people decided they were wrong. They contracted because the economics stopped working. As societies became more complex, as inheritance law became more sophisticated, as property rights became more precisely defined, the costs of the system became clearer. Multiple wives meant disputed inheritance. Disputed inheritance meant court cases and family wars and fragmented estates. Fragmented estates produced weak dynasties. Weak dynasties fell to rivals who didn't have the same problem at home. The spread of Christianity across Europe, an Islamic law that limited wives to 4 but required genuinely equal treatment of all of them, a standard most men could not practically meet, accelerated the contraction. The system did not collapse in a moment. It narrowed slowly, over centuries, as the world changed around it, and the arrangement that had once made cold logical sense began producing more problems than it solved. What remains is not nothing. The traces of these systems are still visible if you know where to look. In inheritance law, in the legal distinction between legitimate and illegitimate children that shaped European law for centuries and still echoes in legal codes today. In palace architecture, the separate wings, the divided quarters, the physical separation of women's spaces from public ones that appears independently in cultures that never contacted each other. In the instinct to rank children by birth order and maternal status that surfaces even in families that have practiced strict monogamy for generations. The household is gone. The logic is still here. The ancient polygamous household was one of the most powerful social technologies ever developed. It built alliances across rival tribes and distant nations. It produced enough children to survive catastrophic childhood mortality. It concentrated power and wealth across generations in ways that shaped the borders, the laws, the institutions that many of us still live inside. And it generated more internal violence, more sons killing sons, more mothers working in silence against rivals, more households quietly destroying themselves from the inside than almost any other domestic arrangement in recorded history. It was enormously effective, and by almost every surviving account from the people who lived within it, it was often quietly devastating at the same time. The kings who built these households wanted legacy above everything else. They got it. They just almost never got to choose what form that legacy took, once the heirs they had worked so hard to produce began competing for the same throne inside the same walls their father had built to protect them. The throne was the point, and the throne is what destroyed them.